So, when you're doing research that involves more than one independent variable, what you're doing is now called a factorial design. So, if you think back to just basic design, you're generally dealing with a single independent variable that has multiple conditions, multiple groups that you can compare. So that's what we call a single factor design. But when you start adding additional factors, now you're literally just adding additional independent variables. So a two-factor design has two independent variables. And you can see that conceptualized over here on the right side of the screen. So my first independent variable has these two different conditions. It could either be the left or the right. And then my other independent variable could be top or bottom. So two independent variables with two different groups in each. This is what we would call a 2x2 factorial design. There's four possible combinations of these two independent variables with their two conditions each. And just to be clear with some terminology, the word factor in factorial design, that just means independent variable. And the word level, that refers to these different treatment groups or conditions. So we use the word factor interchangeably with independent variable, and we use the word level interchangeably with group or treatment or condition. And whenever you do read a study that has done any kind of factorial design, you'll generally see that they use specific kinds of notation to describe that design. For example, a researcher might write, we used a 2x2 factorial. So what that tells you is that there were two different factors, and each factor had two levels. The way you make sense of this is just count how many numbers there are. In a 2x2 factorial design, there's two numbers, right? So that means there's two factors. And then the value for each number tells you how many levels that factor had. So here's one more example. If a researcher were to write, we used a 2x2x3 factorial design, then that means they had three factors. First factor had two levels, second factor had two levels, and the third factor had three levels. So it's a simple and quick way to explain to the reader what your factorial design was like. But let me give you an example from my own research. So this is research I was doing when I was working on my PhD. I wanted to learn more about how people recognize objects, and I thought that two factors could play a big role here. One factor was whether the object was real, like a real natural thing, like fruit or something made by nature, or something artificial, something created by man. So that's factor one. Factor two was if the image you saw was in color or whether it was colorless. So those are my two factors, whether it's real, like natural, or whether it's artificial. And then the other factor was whether it's colored or colorless. So two factors, two levels each. So I showed my participants all possible combinations. So I showed them colorless natural objects, colorless artificial objects, and then colored natural objects and colored artificial objects. So every combination. And by showing them every possible combination, I was able to compare these different combinations of conditions to see which ones did the best and which ones did the worst. So that's the basic idea of factorial design. You want to see how these different factors can combine in interesting ways. And when you start adding more than just two factors, then it starts to get pretty complicated. Here's another example. This is an example of a three-factor design. Let's say you're trying to determine if a new drug for depression works. So you compare the following. Time, so you look at participants' depression before and after they receive the drug. Their prior symptoms, so whether they had mild depression, moderate depression, or severe depression before receiving the drug. And then maybe you're just interested in a gender difference, so you compare men to women. So those are your three factors: time, prior symptoms, and gender. So if you use this kind of design, you'll be able to see if the drug has an effect at all just by looking at change over time. You'll be able to tell if that drug has mild effects or pretty profound effects by looking at differences in the prior symptoms. Like if the people with the most severe depression, if they improve as well, then that's a good sign. And you'll also be able to tell if there's some interesting difference between the genders regarding how this drug works. So this is an example of what we call a 2x3x2. There's 18 possible treatment conditions here. There's 18 different ways that we could combine these three factors. So factorial design is definitely something that you don't read about every day because it is a bit more complicated. It's a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but it is definitely a lot more realistic. If you actually think about it, the real world is a pretty chaotic place. There's all kinds of things that are happening, and they combine in various ways to produce the behaviors that we perform on a daily basis. So if you as the researcher decide to include more factors, you're just making your study a bit more like the real thing, a bit more realistic, a bit more accurate. Human behavior is a very complicated thing, and it's important that we try to capture all the important factors that are playing a role. But the hard part is deciding which factors to include and which factors to exclude, to control, because that is obviously very important. You don't want to include anything in your study that isn't important and potentially going to have an influence. The statistical significance of your results could be severely reduced if you have a lot of unnecessary stuff in there. An unnecessary complication is definitely a big concern. So one thing you could do instead of using a factorial design is you could use multiple single factor designs. Instead of like looking for the drug example I mentioned earlier, instead of comparing people with all these different prior symptoms, you could just do a single study on people with mild symptoms, pre-post for mild symptoms. Then you could do a separate study for people with moderate symptoms pre-post, and then a separate study for people with severe symptoms pre-post. So 3 separate single factor designs. That would work. That would give you similar kind of information. What that's going to be giving you is what we call the main effects for each factor. So when I say main effect, I just mean whether the factor by itself had an effect. But what you're not going to be getting by separating them out like this and studying each factor individually are those interesting combinations I was describing earlier. We call those interactions. And in many cases, those interactions are the most interesting thing in the whole study. So it's very important that you try to measure them as best as you can. And that's the primary advantage to using a multifactorial design. It allows researchers to find those kinds of combinations and see how they can influence human behavior. So when it comes to a 2-factor design, the simplest kind of factorial, you can visualize that pretty easily. Just think of it as like a 2-dimensional matrix like you've seen before. So each cell corresponds to a specific combination of 2 factors. One factor is on our x-axis, the other factor is on the y-axis. Simple. And we will get 3 pieces of information by using this kind of 2-factor design. We'll see if factor 1 has a main effect. If factor 1 does anything interesting by itself. We'll see if factor 2 has a main effect. And then we'll also be able to see if there's any interesting combinations between them. So it's easy to visualize a single factor design. It's easy to visualize a two-factor design. But when it comes to more than two factors, now we're going to have to start thinking in a different way. Like, you could visualize a three-factor design as a three-dimensional matrix, where in each cube in your matrix corresponds to a specific combination of the three factors. So you have your x-axis, your y-axis, and your z-axis. So then we can look at the main effect for factor A, the main effect for factor B, the main effect for factor C, and then all possible combinations of these. So whether there's an interaction between A and B, whether there's an interaction between B and C, whether there's an interaction between A and C, and then whether there's an interaction between A, B, and C. So there's a lot of information. The more factors you add, the more possible combinations there are, and the more interesting data you're going to get from your design. Now, it is possible to have factorial designs with any number of factors, but if you go beyond 3 factors, it starts to get a little hard to visualize. Like, you can picture a single factor, like a line. It's like this, it's at this point in the line or that point in the line. And you can picture a 2-factor design as that kind of 2-dimensional matrix. You can even picture a 3-dimensional or a 3-factor design by thinking of like a cube, like a 3D matrix. But what would a four-dimensional matrix look like? Like, what's a 4-factor design? How can you visualize that? And like I said, this is something we can do. We can have 4 factors, we can have 5 factors, 6 factors, any number of factors. But just how easy it is to think about these kinds of things quickly becomes problematic. So generally, when it comes to doing factorial design, researchers don't go too far. They don't want to include too many because it just gets excessively complicated after a point. So, when it comes to the basics of factorial design, the simplest designs have a separate group of participants for each combination of treatment conditions. They use true independent variables, not quasi-independent variables, like demographic stuff, like gender, for example. So, a true independent variable is one that can be manipulated by the researcher. And when it comes to mixing different kinds of designs together, including between subjects design and within subjects design, or experimental and non-experimental, that is also something that is quite common. When you look at actual factorial design research, you generally see a lot of that kind of mixing going on. Because this actually is a good thing. It allows the researcher to study complicated interactions between these very different kinds of factors that might be in the study. So what we call, when it comes to this kind of stuff, what we call that is a mixed design. Combines 2 different research designs. So mixed designs often include one between subjects factor and one within subjects factor. That's the most simple kind of mixed design. And as I was mentioning, this is generally a good thing. It allows the researcher to take advantage of the benefit of both designs. For example, having a factor between subjects that will help you to deal with order effect confounds, and having a factor within subjects helps you to increase the equivalence of your groups, deal with those individual difference confounds, and it also helps you to reduce the number of participants you need. So here is a table I put together for a very basic kind of mixed design, where you have one between and one within subjects factor. So you see our within subjects factors on the x-axis and the between subjects factors on the y-axis. So here's just the way to think about it. So we have a group of people, and we want to compare them to a different group of people. Sorry, I don't know what happened to that third woman in level 2. Uh, must have been a tragic accident of some kind. But anyways, we have two different groups of people. That's our between subjects factor. So we want to compare them on level 1 of this other factor, the within. And then we also compare that group to itself. And we compare this group to itself. So we can compare the groups to themselves across the within subjects factor, and we can compare the groups to each other across the between subjects factor. It gives us the opportunity to make all these interesting kinds of comparisons. Here's an example of a mixed design. We have already established that memories are more easily retrieved if you put yourself in the same context. So just to give you an example, it's easier to remember something that happened when you were tired if you're tired. It's easier to remember something that happened at school if you go to school. You know, if you put yourself in that context, it'll just be easier to retrieve that memory. So researchers wanted to test this theory using a true experimental design, you know, laboratory kind of test. So here's what they did. They showed all their participants a list containing words related to happiness and words related to sadness. So all participants saw both words. Then they experimentally manipulated their participants' moods by having half of them listen to happy music and half of them listen to sad music. So here's the results that the researchers obtained in this example. As you can see, this between subjects factor, you know, whether the participants were listening to happy music or sad music, did appear to improve the participants' memory if it matched the word type. So if participants were listening to happy music, they could remember more of the pleasant words. If they were listening to sad music, they could remember more of the sad words. So there does seem to be an interesting interaction here. And the basic take-home message from this particular study is that this context effect that we know that memory relies on also applies to the mood of music, for example. So that's the basic kind of like mixed design. You have one between subjects factor and you have one within subjects factor. And the simplest factorial designs, they generally use purely experimental research design, you know, like manipulated variables like this. But not all factorial designs use these perfectly manipulatable variables, like which words to present to a person and which music you're going to present to a person. A lot of researchers are interested in quasi or non-experimental kinds of variables. So if you want to do that kind of research, if you want to combine experimental with non-experimental or quasi-experimental, what you're going to be doing now is something we call a combined strategy. So this is when you have these two very different research strategies used in the same factorial design. So typically with a combined strategy, you have one true independent variable, and then that second variable is usually something like gender or ethnicity. You know, it's like a quasi-independent variable typically, and it falls into one of two categories: a participant characteristic, like the ones I've mentioned, or a time characteristic. So like maybe as a researcher, you just want to know if your treatment effects will persist over a period of time or whether they will be short lasting. One final thing I wanted to mention is that when you do include more than two factors in a factorial design, now what you're doing is something that you could call a higher order factorial design. And here's one way to think about higher order factorial design interactions, where you have, at the minimum, 3 different factors that are all potentially interacting with each other. So there are potential two-way interactions there, where the levels of factor A could have an influence on the levels of factor B. But then there's 3-way interactions and 4-way interactions, and however many factors you have, there could be that kind of an interaction. So if you have a 10 factor design, you have the potential for a 10-way interaction. You know, how some bizarre combination of all these different factors, levels, coming together and producing an effect that you wouldn't see otherwise. This is an extreme example, but the whole idea here is when you add more factors, there's more chances for them interacting in interesting ways.